Hansel and Greta, an apocalyptic fairy tale. The folktale Hansel and Gretel was first published in 1812 in the Grimm's Brothers collection, Children and Household Tales. The brothers edited the collection in several subsequent editions, and soon these stories were wildly popular among both children and adults and managed to find their way into popular culture into the 20th century. Some of these tales were rewritten as fractured fairy tales, some extended as novelizations. Sometimes they appeared in television shows, films, and video games. While not as ubiquitous as other tales in the collection, such as Snow White or Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel still managed to find its way into popular culture in such television shows as the Saturday afternoon cartoon Bugs Bunny and the 2013 action horror film Hansel and Gretel: Witch Hunters. In thinking about and teaching the folktales by the Brothers Grimm in my children's literature classes, I always try to provide as wide an approach to the tales as possible. Bruno Bettelheim, in his book The Uses of Enchantment, takes a Freudian approach to the tales. He offers commentary on many of the tales from the collection, and specifically with respect to Hansel and Gretel, suggests that the story embodies the anxieties of the child, who must overcome and sublimate his primitive and hence destructive desires. According to Maria Tatar, in our eagerness to analyze the childhood fantasies that are said to form the basis of fairy tale plots, we unwittingly reshape the cultural stories we tell to children. With respect to Bettelheim, Tatar suggests that part of what draws Bettelheim to these stories is their Oedipal plots that position the child as a transgressor whose deserved punishment serves as a lesson for unruly children. Jack Sipes takes a much wider view of the social function of fairy tales, particularly those by the Brothers Grimm, and he suggests that the editing process over the years represented a process of what he calls sanitization, in which the brothers managed to make the tales more acceptable to a bourgeois audience by inculcating them with both middle class and Christian values. All this to say, as I read and taught these stories over the years and thought about them, I began to think about them, in relation to some of my other interests, particularly in relation to my interest in young adult dystopian fiction. And so I had to ask myself the question, what would happen if I took one of these Grimm's tales and set it within a post-apocalyptic context? So the results is this story, Hansel and Greta. The road ran past the shack. The wide space in front was littered with car parts and scraps of metal. Behind the shack rose the forest, dark even in the light of noon. Greta watched her father. He was already drunk, his face drawn and gray. He was dragging the fender of an old car across the yard, preparing to salvage whatever he could from the old scrap. Greta had heard her stepmother whispering to her father the night before. "The food's nearly gone," she said. "Another few days and we'll have nothing left. You need to do something." Greta could hear their voices from the alcove where she slept on a pile of old sacks with her brother Hansel. "No food, barely any water. Soon we'll starve," her father murmured a question. "Take them into the forest and leave them there. They're both worthless, especially the girl. If we could sell her in town, that would be something, but no one would pay anything for such a scrawny wretch." Looking now at her father, the hunched and broken man she had once admired, Greta only felt a dull disappointment. If her father had had any courage, he might save them. But she knew her father had no power against the woman who controlled and manipulated him with sex. Greta went to find her brother. About half a mile down the road, she saw him coming out of the trees, a sling in hand. He fell into step beside her on the road. "We need to run away," said Gretel. "Stepmother is planning to abandon us in the forest, so we need to get out of here." Hansel looked up at his sister. "Where are we going to go?" he said. "Far from here, somewhere where people won't want to get rid of us." "Daddy's sick," said Hansel defensively. "It's not his fault. He got that stubborn look that meant he couldn't be reasoned with." Greta tried to be gentle. "But he can't do anything against stepmother. And we need to get away before she simply decides to kill us." Hansel nodded but said nothing. A tear trickled down his cheek. Greta knew that they had to wait until nightfall. The day passed very slowly. In the afternoon, a man came down the road, driving a wagon hauled by an old steer. Its ribs showed like hoops through the filthy hide. Stepmother came hurrying out of the shack when she saw the wagon in the yard. Greta watched her as she stood by the wagon talking to the man. The man stepped down and inspected some of the pieces of scrap metal in the yard. Father helped him load several pieces into his wagon. He climbed back into the cart and handed down 2 sacks, rice or flour. Gretel wasn't sure which. And then he handed down a bottle to Father. Greta knew the routine well. There would be something hot on the scrap metal stove that evening, but her father would be drunk for the rest of the day. At least they could run away on full stomachs. They ate well that evening, a thick stirabout with meat this time. Hansel had managed to get something in the forest with his sling, a rat or a snake. Greta wasn't sure which, and she didn't think she cared. "Tomorrow," said stepmother sweetly, "your father needs your help with an old wreck in the forest." "There's enough places to gather scrap around here," said Gretel. Why go into the forest? She, of course, knew what all of this meant, but she thought stepmother would be less suspicious if she questioned her. "The stranger today told your father about it," said stepmother. "There might be still something left to salvage. Your father needs to go and look, and he needs your help." It almost sounded plausible. Stepmother was certainly manipulative and controlling, but usually she didn't have any imagination whatsoever. Greta glanced once at her father before going to her alcove. She felt a twinge of regret, but not really. They were better off away from this place. In the dead of night, they crept out. This was made easier by stepmother, who had decided to celebrate with several glasses from the bottle the man had given to father that afternoon. Gretel didn't close the door behind them. Greta and her brother spent many days in the forest. Hansel cried sometimes, but sometimes he was able to muster himself enough to get something with his small sling. There wasn't much difference, thought Greta, between starving at home and starving in the forest. They came upon the little house one morning. They were stumbling through the trees, and the next moment, there it was. A neat little cottage in a clearing with a bake oven built along one side. Half a dozen loaves of bread stood cooling on a rack beside the bake oven. They were covered with a wire cage. Greta's hunger didn't let her think. She headed towards the rack of bread. She thought of stealing one of the loaves and then melting back into the forest, but Hansel had ideas of his own. She lost sight of her brother as she reached for the wire cage, and then she looked around with a start when she heard his cry. Leaving the bread, Greta raced around to the front of the cottage, and there she saw her brother caught by the scruff of the jacket by a woman who swung around as she spotted Greta, a shotgun in her hand. Well, well, cackled the old woman, look at the two pretty birds. The woman was tall and thin as a rail, her eyes red from drinking or perhaps madness. She began shoving Hansel before her, waving the shotgun at Greta. Round the back of the house, she said. The woman made Greta lock her brother in a cage behind the cottage. Now, my pretty, since you wanted to steal my bread, you can do some work for me. And she prodded Greta ahead of her with the shotgun. The woman made Greta clean the cottage, starting with scrubbing the floor. She sat in an old armchair by the door. She held the shotgun across her lap and nipped from a bottle occasionally that she held in her other hand. You're a pretty slut, she said. Perhaps Sadie will sell you to the bad men and keep the other bird for herself, she cackled again. You don't have to do that, said Greta. Scrubbing at the floor, the old woman leaned over and spat. Sadie does, she said. If the bad men come, Sadie needs something to trade, and a pretty little slut is just the thing. Did the men hurt you? Why does the little slut want to know? The old woman glared at Greta out of her red eyes. Greta didn't respond. They did try to hurt Sadie, the bad men, but Sadie is too clever, for Sadie always has a knife close to hand. She cut the ropes they bound her with, and then as they slept, she cut their throats. And they left Sadie a present, a little bird of her own. Sadie hated the little bird at first, but then she began to like it. But then it died. I'm sorry they hurt you, said Greta, but you don't have to hurt us. We can help you. But the little slut is helping, said the old woman. She will clean, then she will help Sadie with the oven. Sluts are for selling and birds are for baking, she said in a sing-song voice. The old woman let Greta stop in the afternoon. She gave her a heel of bread and a glass of water to choke it down with. Then the old woman prodded Greta again with the shotgun. Time to get the oven ready, she said. Sadie has a little bird to bake. Greta hauled and cut wood, starting the fire in the bottom of the bake oven. She saw now that the loaves of bread on the rack weren't fresh at all. They were simply left there to lure unwitting strangers. Now, said the old woman, check the oven. Greta looked at her and then at the door to the oven. What am I supposed to do, she said. See if it's hot enough for baking Sadie's bird. She thrust the barrel of the shotgun into Greta's side. How, said Greta, wincing away. Stupid little slut. Like this, she said, and opened the door to the oven. In the days that followed, Greta wondered if she had done the right thing. The old woman was mad, no question, but was she evil? Had she deserved what Gretel had done to her? Greta checked the shotgun after she let Hansel out of his cage. It was old and the action was broken. No shells in the chamber either. There might have been something else to do, but there certainly hadn't seemed like anything else at the time. They buried what was left of the woman just inside the forest, next to a stone that Greta thought must mark another smaller grave. Greta thought about knocking down the bake oven, but it was a perfectly fine oven, and it would have been a waste. Greta found flour and sugar in the cottage, which she sifted in the yard, and then she sent Hansel into the forest to look for something to eat. He came back soon with a brace of birds, and they ate well that evening. They decided to stay on in the cottage. It was livable after they hauled out all the trash that the old woman had collected over the years and burned it in the yard. Greta scrubbed and cleaned, and now they had a place to stay. They would do well here. Perhaps they would make a little garden behind the house, and perhaps they would even find a stray goat or cow wandering in the forest that they could make their own. But they would need something to protect themselves. And maybe that's how it began for the old woman, thought Greta. knowing that you couldn't always protect yourself from strangers, knowing that people who came through the forest were starving and dangerous. Day after day, watching all the time until the solitude made her crazy, turning her into a fairy tale witch who lay in wait for children to roast in her oven. Hansel and Greta were happy enough in the cottage until one day Hansel, feeling restless, decided to leave and find his fortune elsewhere. The days and months and years went by, and Greta lived there alone, a shotgun close to hand. It was one that she'd acquired from a stranger, a decent enough man. He didn't ask for much, and she needed the gun. Greta talked to herself as there was no one else to talk to. And sometimes she could hear voices coming from the forest, or she thought she could. Voices that spoke of danger, of intruders, of something coming through the trees. And sometimes she thought she could see something, a shadow. And sometimes it looked like the figure of a bent hag shambling through the trees. And sometimes Greta thought she caught sight of two frightened children walking hand in hand, lost and hungry, and seeking shelter in a world that knew nothing of kindness or mercy.